We're back with Therapy is Dope with Alicia and Laura. I'm starting to like sing that. Like, what?
I know, but you should actually sing it because you have a great voice, and that might hit.
As I say, I heard a little bit of harmony in there. I liked it.
Today we have Michael Anthony with us, and I'm excited to talk about men's health and maybe some psychedelics. Who knows? I tend to work that into every
Every
conversation.
conversation,
That's
yeah.
good.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got to doing what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. So I am an LCSW in the Tampa Bay area. I primarily practice out of St. Petersburg, contracted at two different group practices, KDM Counseling Group and Integrative Counsel. I've been doing therapy for about 5 years at this point. My story on how I got into it is actually really interesting. I was actually a touring musician for many years, and
Oh,
that was kind of my initial dream was to get to that point, but I had always had an interest in therapy as well, and it's really fun when you're in a tour van for many hours trying to mediate between different band members. I definitely recognized I had a talent for this kind of thing. So once I kind of lived that dream, I'd diverted or kind of shift my focus, and now I just absolutely love what I'm doing now. So as you said, I specialize a lot in men's mental health. I do a little bit of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. I recognized that, there was a very big gap between, males accepting mental health and really trying to get assistance for that. I think the CDC report I had read that was very shocking was even though males make up like 70 to 80% of the suicide rate, only one third of the population of people in therapy are males. So it's just a massive gap, and I really am passionate about reducing the stigma around it, and yeah, getting more males help because they need it.
hell yes. I have a million questions already.
Okay.
All right, I'll go with a very simple one. Do you still play music?
I definitely still play music. I don't play in the same band anymore. I definitely play more local. I definitely have put the tour van days behind me.
Um, okay, the deeper question. Uh, Men's mental health. I totally agree that it needs to be like much more of a focus because you know, a lot of the messaging around men in general is like what it means to be a man is to like shut off a lot of your humanity, which is
Mhm.
like, do we even understand what it means to be human? So I guess I'm curious what your opinion is around like what the difference between men's mental health is versus women's and like what is mental health in the experience of men in general.
Well, I think you bring up a really, really good point. And that's definitely one of the stigmas that I'm trying to reduce. A lot of males have grown up with that mentality of nose to the grindstone, put on the different hats of provider, father, husband. I think the classic thing, the classic nomenclature I like to use is the whole just rub dirt on it and keep going forward,
Mhm.
kind of thing. So and a lot of males, we didn't grow up with emotional training, emotional intelligence, how to
Mm.
identify emotions, what emotions even are, what emotions even mean. I find even when I'm working with couples, I do some couples work as well, that one of the common dynamics I find is really men struggling with empathy because they don't understand what true empathy means, right? You can say, I understand, right? But unless you can truly understand what the emotion feels like, that's a completely different thing. I mean, even in my own experience, I can't tell you how many times, maybe my wife will ask me what's wrong, and I actually have to sit and try to identify it. I know that I feel off, right? But I don't know exactly what it is. So using a lot of tools like the famous feelings wheel or things along those
Mm.
lines can really help identify more specifically, that I'm feeling, let's say, distant rather than just off. So yeah, definitely a lot of training needs to go into that.
Hmm. So how does a man like what would how would he experience his mind if he was being mentally healthy?
I like to bring up the idea of what I call the mindful male, right? I think that there's a lot of, especially with that very kinetic, like fire energy of always needing to achieve, always needing to go a step further, not learning how to slow down. So I teach martial arts on the side, and I like to incorporate it a lot with like as if you're sparring, right? If you get too
Mm.
caught up in your emotions or you get too caught up in the situation at hand, you can start form a lot of blind spots, right? But the more you understand yourself as a whole, the easier it is to pivot when things might not be going a certain way, right? So you find a lot of potential like anger issues, right, with the male population. And a lot of that is due to the fact that they don't have the ability to pivot when they need to, or they'll just not talk about things that eventually just builds up until you get the straw that breaks the camel's back. All that energy starts to surge forward, and that can be very, very chaotic, right? So the mindful male, I would say, is somebody that can really take a breath and understand how they feel in any sort of situation. And I would argue that that would actually make your kind of need to achieve, move forward, things like that. I'd like to equate it to if you're feeding your fire with like a presence of earth, right? It can burn hotter and longer and is more contained rather than just being like all consuming and
Mm.
burn things down
Yeah.
around you, if you will.
Mm, that's a good one. I just
Yeah.
wrote a paper about men and empathy because I thought that maybe testosterone was the difference. Like Laura was asking, like, what's the difference between men's mental health and women's mental health? And I was like, okay, when women take testosterone, we sometimes do have a surge in anger. So maybe it's the testosterone. And there is some evidence of that in the research from what I found. I'm curious if you have any input on that. Um, but by and large, the research seems to indicate that this is socialization, that this is a problem that we as a culture, really young, telling boys to walk it off or put some dirt on it or whatever,
Mhm.
and teaching them that it's not okay for them to be vulnerable or cry or whatever. And that I think is really interesting because according to the research, little boys cry just as much, if not more, than
Mhm.
women. And then we're doing this to them. I can't imagine the compression of emotions then that are in there. And then if we talk about, and I'm sorry to keep going here, but
Please.
older men who
Mhm.
have lived their entire lives like this. I mean, where do you even start with that?
Well, I
Yeah.
always like to tell them that the hardest step is just coming in for the first time,
Mm,
right? And
Yeah.
actually sitting down. And I will recognize, a little bit of resistance as we start, but what I usually find is once you can kind of get through the initial stages of what therapy actually is, right? There's a little bit more openness. I really, really try to provide like a safe, comfortable environment. I can relate to the experience. I think that the therapeutic rapport is probably the most important piece to progress, whether or not there's a successful or unsuccessful therapeutic experience. And so I really try to hammer in that, like really trying to make that connection, really trying to make it comfortable. I've never been a fan of rigid therapy, if you will. But to go along with what you're saying, because I think, again, another really good point is the social aspect, right? There aren't many things that we can find that celebrate men's mental health. You look at even, media, like movies, TV shows, things like that. You've got the stoic character, like the James Bonds and the Batmans and the things along those lines. But there's never any sort of, scene where they're going to therapy or talking about how that thing made them feel, right? It's
except
just
in Ted
all
Lasso.
I
Yeah.
love Ted Lasso. I think it's
The best.
fantastic. Very excited for the next season to come out soon, so it's going to be awesome. But yes, no, I agree with you. So it's very refreshing to see things like a Ted Lasso, right?
Mm.
Come to fruition, to kind of really break the mold a little bit because as a culture and as a society, it wasn't something that was really brought up as something that's important.
Hmm. So I totally agree. And I remember listening to some podcast that talked about like the socialization component of like how young girls, when they get in a disagreement with each other, like they talk to each other. When when young boys get in a disagreement, they like wrestle or punch each other and then they move on, right? So like
Hmm.
from the very beginning, women are like being trained on the skill set of like using your words and talking through things, and like men are, I mean, I think there's a little wisdom in there of like, but men are just kind of move through it. But there's the wisdom of like integrating your body in
Hmm.
the releasing practice of that.
Hmm.
And, we talk about men versus women, but there's also like the masculine versus the feminine energy that exists in both genders, right?
Right.
And I know you have some history around somatics,
Hmm.
right? So
Yes.
is that kind of a true thing that like women are kind of getting the socialization around like their emotional communication with each other, but the wrestling, I mean, it might create a gap in their understanding of the emotions in the bigger spectrum, but there's something about moving their body that is helping them downregulate.
Yeah, I think totally. I think that movement, I forget what study I had read, but they had proposed the question of like if depression, anxiety, mental health symptoms have been around forever, what did people do before therapists existed? And it really came down to two main pillars, which is community and movement, right? And
Mm,
so I think that movement in
sounds
itself is a good release of energy. That's why I really love to bring some of the martial arts stuff into the therapeutic
mm,
space because that movement of body does help energy flow. Like I think you said it great, the balance between the divine masculine, divine feminine, we have both, right?
Yeah.
So there is that kinetic force, but we also need to learn how to listen, right? We need to learn how our emotions are actually speaking in the body, right? So
Mm.
body and brain, we speak two different languages, right? Or we can have thoughts, we can have rationalizations, intellectualizations, but the body speaks in sensations, right? So it's the same as if I'm really upset and you tell me, oh, you should just calm down, right? That's not going to work. I know that,
I
right? But my
hate that.
body isn't regulating that, right? My body needs something else, right?
Yeah.
So yes,
Yeah.
I think there's definitely a point there about how that movement piece can kind of release, but I think it also brings up another issue about how younger generations, especially males, right, don't know how to process things like trauma, right? So they don't have that ability to talk about these things, right? Or they weren't encouraged to talk about these things, right? But emotions are energy, right? So if we have a lot of that traumatic energy stored up within us, that's going to be expressed in one way or another, right? So the body language or, the wrestling or things along those lines could be like almost like a need that's being satisfied, right? But it's not necessarily in the vocalization, the connection, things like that that's needed. One of the things that I love asking people, obviously, is what your support system looks like. Who are your friends, who are the people you can turn to, and I have a lot of people that'll name a whole bunch of people, but then I always ask the question, well, when was the last time you actually engaged those people? Right. And the response I always get is, I don't want to be a burden. They've got their own stuff going on, right? Things like that. And it's like great.
Mm.
It's great to say you have these people, right? But when are you actually using these people?
Yeah. Like
Something,
one of
go
my
ahead.
favorite things Simon Sinek says is like, how dare you rob me of the opportunity to show up for you?
Oh, I like that.
Oh,
Hmm.
And it's like, I understand that, like, I don't want to be a burden, but that is our vulnerability of being rejected,
Hmm.
right?
I
And
like
like,
that.
part of building the community is learning who you can go to for things. And like, it's a real thing because you have people and they want to show up,
Hmm.
but that doesn't always mean they know how to show up. And when you're in that really vulnerable state, going to someone and they don't know the right way to show up, that can still feel like isolation, even if it's not rejection. And so there's kind of this like pruning and cultivation period of like building your real community. But if you don't ever lean on them, you're going to find yourself in this like impossible situation where like like your parent passes or something, right? Like a really
Hmm.
big thing happens and you need to lean on someone and you lean on the wrong people because you haven't tested it out, and
Hmm.
then you feel more alone. And I think there's a responsibility we have to ourselves to understand what we need to take care of ourselves, and I like we forget that.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
think having a community is a really important component of it.
Hmm.
Um, why do you think, like, is it just the fear of rejection? Like, why
I,
are men resistant to like actually letting themselves be known by other men?
Again, I think part of it goes back into the socialization piece because men will sometimes see vulnerability as weakness, right? They will not be able to, or they're afraid of opening up because of what that might say about them, right? It goes back to that stigmatization, right? And just learning that it's okay to be vulnerable and it's okay to be open. I always like to ask, actually, I can relate this to a personal experience. A buddy of mine is going through, a really hard divorce, and we've got tons of friends in our circle that have been through a similar scenario, but I'm the only one he wants to talk to. So I'm like, well, why don't you talk to our other buddy, right? And he was like, well, again, burden, things along those lines. And I asked him, okay, look at everybody we have in our circle. Which one will turn you away?
Mm,
And he couldn't answer that question, right? Because everybody would be open if he was just able to be vulnerable and not be afraid of weakness.
yeah. I think the word is exposure. Like I agree that like socially we equate vulnerability and weakness,
Hmm.
and I personally have been like very intentional with the language because like Brene Brown's research is it's emotional exposure, risk, and uncertainty, right? Like that's
Hmm.
vulnerability, and it's the exposure that makes us feel weak
Hmm.
because we are literally like our armor is off. So
Hmm.
we're undefended, right?
Hmm.
And so it's not weakness because it takes a lot of courage to actually be vulnerable. You have to say like I know I could be rejected. I know that there's a threat right here and I'm going to move through it because the reward or the potential of the reward of being seen, of being supported is worth me acting with courage. So like
Hmm.
when we think of it from that standpoint, the experience feels exposing,
Right.
but the act is actually very courageous.
I agree with that. Absolutely agree with that. I think that's a great point.
Or
I
Heather.
was I was thinking about the Brene Brown Atlas of the Heart, where she explores some feeling words that we don't tend to use,
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
and how important that piece is. And I was just reading a newsletter from Dr. Dan Siegel, and he had in there like name it to tame it. That's like he
Yeah.
loves his little rhymes or whatever.
Oh yeah.
Uh, so. And both of you have talked about the importance of semantics and the importance of being able to identify what the feeling is in the first place. But I also wanted to say this thing about being a burden. One of the things that I try to teach my clients is that your problems are not a problem for anybody else that's hearing them most of the time.
Hmm.
Most of the time, it's not impacting my life. So I'm just here to be a support. And it also gives people the opportunity to be grateful because people are like, "Whew, thank God that's not happening to me."
Hmm.
And I think that's an important gift, if you will, to be able to give to people sometimes because it's very easy to get caught up in our own problems and our own tasks and forget that other people have stuff going on too. And sometimes we actually don't have it that bad.
Yeah. It really puts things into perspective.
Yeah. I'm gonna jump backwards for a second because you said this and my face got all contorted and I want to talk about it more. The like learning how to listen to our body and how it speaks a different language.
Hmm.
Um, totally agree. How do you teach that?
A lot of that comes through somatic experiencing, I think is probably one of the most effective ways of, really understanding what your body is trying to tell you, right? Because that's a really, I mean, even just the body tracking in itself, bringing up something, that could cause or bring up some sort of emotion and really tuning into, well, where do you feel it, right? Like I know when I was going through somatic experiencing, I'm a pretty laid back guy, but I started to recognize that I stored a lot of anger like in my shoulder. Like it would always kind of start to heat up when I would think about things. And so it can really show up in the most interesting places when you take a moment to just turn your intention inward, right? Like when we teach, some of the meditation, some of the qigong and things along those lines, I always like to start class by, trying to move your intention from your mind down into what your body is experiencing, right? And sometimes you hear people talk about when I have anxiety, I feel it in my chest, right? Or when I feel depression, I feel it in my stomach, right? And so when you just take the moment to tune in to what your body is trying to tell you, the easier it is to work with some of those symptoms. I love the naming the emotion, right? But what does the emotion feel like? And a lot of people think about, it's interesting because sometimes, or a lot of times, we look at what are the quote unquote like negative experiences that you're having and what does that bring up, right? Like the anxieties, the depressions, the angers, and things like that. But we don't spend too much asking, well, where does the good start to come up? When you feel proud, when you feel grateful, when you feel joyful, right? What are those sensations? And those are equally as important to understand because if you understand what feels good, right, then you can really create that difference and that balance and that harmony.
So two questions, and then sorry, Alicia, I'll let you go. So I'm a neurosomatic intelligence coach. So a lot of the language I'll use, because I'll say like, where do you feel it in your body? And sometimes people don't know what that, like how to even navigate that because they're so disconnected from their body that they're just like, I don't know. So some of the language that I'll use is like, okay, do you feel a temperature? Are you hot, cold, neutral? Do you feel heavy or light? Do you feel tense or loose? Is that something that you also guide people through, or do you kind of keep it more broad in the like, where do you feel it and like see what they kind of give you?
A little bit of both. I love that terminology. I use that a lot too, right? Is it a temperature? Is it neutral? Is there a tingling? Where does it feel maybe more open, more free in your body, right? Really trying to understand that, pendulation, that kind of differentiation between the
Mhm.
two. But sometimes I will keep it a little bit more freeform, right? If we're talking about, I mean, and you'll see it a lot, like when we talk about things like anxiety or depression, like I said, that tightness in the chest, a lot of people can really bring that up, right? Even as we're talking or when I do EMDR with clients, like you'll see some of those symptoms start to come up, right? We need to maybe do some breath work, some regulation in between, some of your sets, right? They'll start to kind of really feel some of these physical sensations. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. I love that the structures of like the somatic experiencing in itself, like like, is it a tingling? Is it a temperature? I always like to ask the question as well, if that sensation had something to say, what would it say? Right. That's always a
Well,
really good one.
that's the one I'm always curious about because like the mind and the body speak different language, but the interpreter,
Hmm.
obviously we have our limiting beliefs and all our different lenses and distortions. So whether like in a therapy container or coaching container that feels like a safer environment for the interpreter to be more honest, but if you're out in the world trying to navigate this and you're in a stressful environment, this is something I grapple with. So I'm very curious your opinion is like how do you teach them what the like when to trust the interpreter, I suppose.
I like that. I think that's where breath work really comes in. I always like to say that if you can recognize when your nervous system is starting to get activated or you're starting to recognize some sensations and you can find a moment to even just fit in a deep breath or two, right? It almost kind of creates this pause. It gives you a little
Mhm.
bit more control and helps you zoom out a little bit more to kind of see the situation objectively. What am I feeling? What am I thinking? Right? And what do I want to do with it? That whole statement of the difference between reacting and responding, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes all it takes is really just one breath to kind of zoom out and get a little bit more understanding. So when we get caught up and the nervous system starts to get activated and, kind of gets all out of whack, right? That's where we get a lot of maybe the anger explosions, right? Or things like that. That energy likes to get trapped in that emotional state. We see red, things. So it's really about, and that's one of the things I really love to teach is if you notice, like, let's say you're saying and doing things you don't mean or you regret when you're at a 10, right? What do you start to recognize when you're at like a 6 or a 5 or a 4, right? And really trying to nail it down to, I had a client one time, again, anger issues, male with anger issues, and we were able to track it down so far that he recognized that when his hands started doing this, right? That was his very first indicator that he was on that road, to having a blow up, right? So even just that recognition and that practice of, oh, my hands are doing this, I need to do something. Let me fit in a breath, right?
Yeah.
Or a couple breaths, right? Really put that aspect of control back in for him, right? And now he's doing great because he has a little bit more of that awareness. This is my body telling me something's wrong, right? So
Mhm.
let me breathe and kind of zoom out and look at it. Okay, here's the direction I want to go. Maybe I need to step away. Maybe I need to communicate that I'm frustrated, right? Or just put up some of the boundaries, whatever that may be to hold off from getting to a 10, because we know what that looks like.
I am listening and thinking, how much did martial arts help you with this? Because I feel like you may have already had some mindfulness exposure. I don't know if you did martial arts before. I'm assuming. Tell us about that.
Yeah, martial arts was a really big part of my life and actually helped really. It's a cool story because when I started doing martial arts, I wasn't licensed yet. I was working, 9 to 5. I was working in community mental health. And it wasn't until I started doing the martial arts and really understanding the mind-body breath connection, right, that it really started to help and make me feel more empowered to actually take the risk of going back to school, getting licensed, going into private practice,
Oh,
things along
cool.
those lines. Because the more we can tune into what our mind is doing, what our body is feeling, and really try to bring all those things together, the more holistic of an idea we have. So you think about like maybe negative feedback loops that we have, right? Always looking at the negatives, always looking at the deficits, the areas of improvement, right? But the more you spend in meditation and recognize where your mind is going, trying to bring it back to the breath, things like that, the more you can kind of understand those are just thoughts. So let me rearrange to where I'm improving, right? Where am I, succeeding rather than where am I, quote unquote, failing, right? The more you
Hmm.
do that, the more you move your body, the more you focus into the breath, the more centered you feel. So it really started to help me feel more empowered the more I started to understand how my body was working and how dysregulated I was when I first started getting into the practice.
That is so cool.
That's
I also
cool.
want to do a little brag for a moment. On the way to camp this morning, my oldest was like, "Oh, I'm getting butterflies
Aw.
in my stomach." And I didn't realize until after, but I was like, "Oh, she was feeling it in her body. I gotta praise her for that."
Yeah.
I was so excited when I realized it though, because that's I think the kids are easier to teach, but I also think when we're adding language to things, they get confused. So
Mm.
Yeah.
I don't think you work with kids at all though, do you, Michael?
No, no, I don't
Yeah.
work with children.
Okay. What was the other thing I wanted to say? Oh, how did you get into ketamine? So we haven't really gone there yet, but I
Yeah.
like the way I worded that too.
Just dive right in.
Yeah. Well, no. So, Integrative Council, which is one of the groups that I'm contracted under, they started to get into the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy space. And I was really interested in that just because of the science behind it and, like what it was saying that it could do for people with, trauma and trying to really work through that. So I elected to be part of it, get trained in it, things like that. And then, I had to actually experience it myself, right? Just as a lot of these
Naturally.
modalities take, right? Experience it before you teach it, right? And I could see the power that it had behind it. It was very calming. I was really able to make some really cool connections, just within my own mental space. And it was something that I became more and more excited about. I've always thought just kind of in the personal side of things that, the psychedelic route can hold a lot of magic and hold a lot of power for the people that, are ready to lean into that. And so even just the experiences I've had working with clients, I mean, just profound transformations. It could be even just a single session dosing. I had a client, and I'm relating it a lot to client experiences, but I mean, it's the best thing to pull from. I had a
Mhm.
client that came in with just crippling anxiety, right? Like before he would go on a work trip, right? His partner would have to like calm him down, right? Things like that. He had one ketamine session and he said it was like a light switch flipped. He just did not experience anxiety at all. He had like a work trip a couple days later. He was totally fine, went on it. He came back in for maybe 2 or 3 more dosing sessions just to, really reinforce it. But yeah, he discharged. I keep in touch with him every once in a while. He's thriving, just even
Ah,
after the
that's
one session.
awesome.
So yeah, it
Like
was
a
really cool.
dream outcome.
Right? Exactly. I thought that was really, really neat.
Yeah.
So what do you, okay, so I have gotten conflicting information about how this works. So,
Mhm.
um, when somebody, first of all, are you doing the IV ketamine or are you doing intramuscular or are we doing Spravato? What are we doing?
So we do sublingual. We do the lozenges. So we partner
Didn't even give
with
that option.
So we partner with Journey Clinical, right? So since we're just a mental health facility, right, we don't have doctors to, give out the medications, but Journey Clinical has been really great. They take care of all the psychiatric evaluations, they take care of all the medical stuff, and then they will send the client their medication to bring into session. And one of the things that we really like to focus on that I think unfortunately some other like ketamine providers don't is the integration, right? Is you have the experiences is you have the learning, you come out of these things, we do like intention settings and things like that, but we always make sure that we do it at least one session in between, right? Dosings to actually be like, okay, let's reset, right? Let's talk about what we figured out. What are we going to do with this, right? Like, so now that you've got this, how are we going to fit this into your mental health treatment plan, right? What are the changes that you can make? What are some of the things that you've learned that then we can kind of take out into the world, right? And just again, move us towards our goals, right? I think that some ketamine is ultimately just let me have your experience, flush you out, see you next time, right? And there's
Yes.
just this massive gap of, okay, I've got all this learning, I've got all this information, I've made all of these insights, but now what do I do with it? And so we really like to provide that as kind of the in-between. We don't want to just leave you hanging, right? We want to make sure that this is actually something that's productive and can move you forward rather than something that could just be one and done, if you will.
Okay, so pardon my language on this one.
By all means.
During the high for the client,
Hmm.
are you
Hmm.
having a conversation? That's the part that I'm getting conflicting information on. Like, does the client have their own experience and then talk to you afterwards, or are you talking during the experience?
So what we usually do is we'll do an intention session, right, where we really talk about what we're trying to get out of the experience, right? We'll kind of go over like the safeguards, right, the roles, try to get an idea of what the ideal session would look like. We're talking about like eye masks, pillows, certain playlists, right, things along those lines. Then they'll come in the next session and do the dosing. Right. And I'm there ultimately as a facilitator. So I am there to just kind of watch over, make sure everything is safe. If they have something that kind of comes up that they need to talk about or need to breathe or something along those lines, I'm there to facilitate that role. Once they come out of their experience, right, we always make sure that we give extra blocks of time to make sure that, like they're completely done. We never let anybody drive afterwards. They have to have somebody come pick them up. That's part of the regulations, right? But we always try to at least start to talk a little bit about what the experiences was like. But it's really not until that next integration session when they've had time to really get that information to soak in, right? That we have the full conversation about, okay, you've had your experience. We talked briefly about maybe some of the things that you were experiencing coming out of it, but now you've had a couple days to journal, reflect, think about it a little bit more. Now let's come back in with what you've really pulled out of that experience. And that's the information we really like to work with when it comes to the integration.
Okay. Yeah, I heard that you couldn't. Well, the girl I was talking to did IV ketamine, and she was
Mhm.
like, "Yeah, you can't really have a conversation with people during." But then we did a podcast with a girl who does microdosing, and you can have a whole session while on the ketamine. So I wasn't sure how it worked in your experience.
Yeah, so in theory, when you're talking about that, just from me just having ideas, like I don't really necessarily have any sort of like, science or experience to say this, but I could see how that would be a little bit different, right? With a microdose, right? I could assume that, there would be a little bit more coherency to have, like an actual talk therapy session. When you're doing like a full ketamine experience, from my experience with the clients that I have, it's a very like relaxing, very kind of going under the surface, kind of experience. I mean, I even know in my own experience, right, in my training, it would have been really hard for me to have like a full talking session while under, the
Sure.
full dose of ketamine.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Okay, so it's dose dependent and kind
yes.
of meeting the moment and also like potentially how it's given, like IV versus pill, etc.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well,
I'm
I
with you.
guess not necessarily because hers was a micro dose still. So
So
Hmm.
it's more dose
I would
specific, which
just,
makes
Yeah, I
sense.
think
Like
I
your
think
state of
dose
mind to
specific.
be able
Yeah.
to communicate things.
Right. Yeah. I would definitely see it as a dose specific thing.
Huh.
so how many integration sessions do you normally need? Because we also had a guy who does mushroom journeys, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
And that's like their whole business. And he says that they do all this like virtual integration work with people afterwards.
Hmm.
So, and it's like a whole program. So how many sessions? And I didn't realize that you needed to give it time to like absorb. I mean, I guess it
Hmm.
makes sense for processing purposes, but
Hmm.
I didn't realize that piece either. So, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, we try to fit at least one integration session in between. I usually like to do at least two, just because that second one, we can catch up on, how they were using the integration that we discussed, but then it can also set us up for, again, leave us time to do, the setup work for the next dosing session, right? Intentions, playlists, what you're expecting, things along those lines. So I think it's beneficial to have at least two in there, to really kind of set the intention. Okay, what are we going to do with this, right? And then another one to talk about what have we done with this, right? What are we getting into? Is what's working, what's not working? What are some barriers to really gain a full understanding, or more full understanding? And then again, it benefits us because it also gives us time to really talk about what the next one is going to be like.
So when we add trauma in there,
Hmm.
when they are talking to you about it afterwards, is it like I saw my trauma and I dealt with it, or is it like I just feel different about it?
Mm. It mixed results actually. Some people
Okay.
have had experiences where they've, worked through it, right? Talked to younger self, and that's why I really like to, experimenting a little bit with introducing the EMDR into, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy as well, right? Because I think the science behind the ketamine is that, the learning tendrils in your brain that would usually retract, during a traumatic experience actually stay open because of the ketamine chemicals. And so when you introduce something like EMDR into the mix, right, you can have very deep and profound conversations with younger self. Just everybody, like to say, everybody's experience on EMDR is different, but it's not as activating as maybe it would have been, right? We've already been through that dosing session. We're already in that state of calm. Maybe we've already had a lot of insights, right? And so in theory, it's a really good time to really dig in and start to try to construct these new neural pathways that EMDR can really assist with. You're already on the path of desensitization. Why not add the icing on the cake?
Sounds awesome to me.
It
Icing's
is.
my favorite part. So,
Yeah.
I mean, on like in cakes, I haven't done that, but makes sense.
The icing is the favorite part. I can get
Yeah,
on board with that. I can get on board with
right.
that.
Icing's definitely the best part.
Mhm.
So another question.
Yes.
When we talk about inner child, I always think of IFS and Dr. Richard Schwartz. Schwartz, did I say that right?
Mhm.
And I guess for me, the overarching concept is that we have these different parts of ourselves and that we are neglecting or ignoring or avoiding these different parts of ourselves. And even even if you take Dr. Dan Siegel's work into consideration, he talks about integration a lot and he talks about it in a different way. But to me, I feel like they kind of all go together. The psychedelic stuff, the parts work, and integration. It's all about identifying these different parts of yourself and kind of giving them a voice and then bringing it all together into the present moment. Would you say that too, or am I being kind of crazy over here?
No, I would agree with you. I think there was a colleague of mine that put it beautifully. One of the examples I usually like to give is, you almost envision your present self as the driver of a school bus, and in all of the seats behind you are all of the past versions of you, right? It's all still you, but in different timelines, right? Like very young you is like in the back of the bus, all the way up to, maybe a teenager, all the way up to you being the driver, right? So all those pieces are still within you, and all of them still have a voice. So what you'll run into sometimes, like when you're doing EMDR, is we'll ask, we call it like the SUDS number, right? So what's the stress level, that this memory is bringing to you? Scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the worst. And I'll have people say, they'll talk about something that must have been horrendous to go through. But then when I ask them what their stress level is, they'll say like, it happened so long ago, I'd call it like maybe a 4, right? And then you have to take a second and be like, well, hold on. What was it like for that version of you to experience that? Oh, you want me to think about what it was like back then? Yes, of course. Oh, well, then it was at like a 10. It's like, yeah, that person is still inside of you, still experiencing that 10, right? So we have to really put ourselves back in that mindset and really connect with who we were at that time that experienced that trauma to really get more of that holistic desensitization and reprocessing.
Hmm.
Ooh, that's such a good point. That it's still okay. For example, I have a client who had a traumatic SA event, sexual
Mhm.
assault event, around Labor Day. And every year, right before Labor Day, the nightmares start. And then Labor Day is terrible. And then after Labor Day is like trying to catch our breath again. And the client is always very critical, like, how has it been this long and I'm still having this reaction? And the way you just described it is like, oh, that makes perfect sense because that part of you still lives inside of you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. So the parts of us that live, I mean, I totally agree with this in general, but obviously we talked a little bit about like vulnerability and exposure and courage and just kind of navigating that. And I think something you're highlighting, Alicia, is like how we have this perception that like time should make this better and make it go away. And like when you understand trauma, you understand like that's not necessarily how the body experiences it. So like all these
Mhm.
concepts of like the language of the body, understanding like our complete self to be able to guide ourselves through it. I guess what is the potential damage of not getting to know our parts and like
Mm.
your I'm curious both of your experience because like I'm a coach, you guys are therapists, like it's a little bit of a different angle.
Mhm.
Um, what have you seen from clients, I guess, who have been like resistant to getting to know their parts?
Mm. Well, I like to say that emotions are energy, right? And energy wants to flow. And so when we have these traumatic scenarios that we don't deal with, energy gets stuck, right? And there's plenty of information and science coming out that says, like stuck energy can cause like devastating physical health issues, like heart problems, blood pressure, neurodegradation. I mean, I pick your poison, but literally poison, right? And so when you don't take the time to really understand how these situations affect you and affect your nervous system and affect your triggers, affect your responses, things along those lines. I mean, it can really, it's I like to almost visualize it as just like these pressure points in your body, right? Where this energy just kind of gets like stuck, right? And the less attention you pay to that, right, the worse it can become over time. You might have anger issues that you don't know where they originate, but then you do, maybe some EMDR work and recognize that a very young version of you had a situation where they weren't able to express that anger and now it has manifested into something current, right? I mean, there's so many different layers and it's really, really interesting. That's why I love this kind of work, just the different angles and the different things you can discover when you turn that intention inward and actually take the time to measure, like where you're at, where these things may manifest and what you need to do to heal that.
Hmm. I love that. And tangential question, I guess, but
Sure.
I have this perception, could be flawed, but that a lot of men, when they come finally kind of get over that first initial hump to like go to therapy, it's often inspired by someone else wanting them to,
Hmm.
right?
Oh yeah.
Um, so for whether that's a spouse or a boss or whatever it might be, regardless of that, like what if a single guy or whatever is like listening to this and is like, why would I want to do that? Like, what is the actual value I would gain from getting to know my complete self and like being able to understand these parts? Because we talk about it and we can understand like the healing and what that does for us, but like, how would it help him?
Hmm. I think Joseph Campbell had a really amazing quote that I love to live by, which is that sometimes the treasure you seek is in the darkest caves. And I think
Mm,
that, I think that when although it can be intimidating or scary, or we might have a resistance or, things along those lines, I think the power that you can find from understanding yourself holistically, through mind, through body, through behavior. I mean, you think about thoughts, feelings, behaviors, that whole loop, right? When you can really close that circuit, the more empowered you can feel and the the more mindful you can be in your decision making and just the way that you interact with others, right? I know a lot of males don't like to talk about feeling insecure, right? But we all have insecurities, right? And if we have insecurities, we can overcompensate. It's all there's something that's out of balance, right? And when we can really, find that balance and that harmony, it can be almost more empowering for you to be able to reach these goals in a way that doesn't have detrimental effects to yourself or other people around you.
Well said. I totally agree. I'm just curious as someone who focuses on male specific, because like I'm lucky enough to have like a phenomenal dad.
Hmm.
And so I love men and I want them to feel safe to be human and to be whole
Hmm.
and to see that their soft sides or the divine feminine that lives in them is beautiful.
Hmm.
Um, despite probably multiple rejections that they've gotten, that that's untrue.
Hmm.
Um, and I like if my dad would never go to therapy. He loves that I do, but he would never do it.
Right.
And he's told me that. And I wish I could like articulate that to him. I mean, he's 70. He's not going to do it now. But
Sure. Yeah.
right,
Hmm.
just understanding like that you have a greater sense of being able to lead yourself and lead
Hmm.
your life and like
Hmm.
be at peace within versus at war.
Hmm. I love how you said that, like because I think that's another role that a lot of males have a tendency to take on is that leadership role, right? And so
Yeah.
how do you lead yourself, right? You can lead a herd, you can lead a team, you can lead, different groups, but how do you really lead yourself, right? Are you making choices in empathy of others or empathy of yourself, right? I think is like a really powerful question
Like,
to ask
would you want
yourself.
to follow yourself as a leader?
Ooh, I like
Like,
that. I like that.
like
Would
how
you
do
want
you
to follow
speak to
yourself
yourself?
as a leader? Yeah, yeah, I
Right. Like
like
I do
that.
that with a
Hmm.
lot of my corporate clients of like if your inner dialogue was like your external manager, would you want to follow them? And
Hmm.
almost everyone's like no. And I'm like, so I
Should
mean
tell
that
us something.
Then
kind
what
of
do we want to do
explains
with
the
that?
problem, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, right.
But I think when we, like I said earlier, like I think we have a responsibility to ourselves or like an opportunity, whether it's a responsibility or an opportunity or both, to like no one knows how to take care of ourselves better than us. And we
Mhm.
don't know how to take care of ourselves, but the art of learning that holistic journey is where we build the skills. And then we have that kind of calm, grounded confidence to navigate whatever life's going to throw at us.
I completely agree. It's one of the things I love telling my clients when they first come in is that, I want them to understand that everybody has their own equation, right? What worked for the person I saw before you and what'll work for the person I see after you may not work for you at all, right? But there's beauty in having the conversations. And again, that's one of the things that I really, going back to therapeutic rapport, I think being like the most important, piece between successful and unsuccessful therapy. That's the way that I like to practice is, I don't like to be super rigid. I like to be more laid back. I like to be relatable, right? I always like to say that, humans having a human experience and we're just figuring it out, right? Like
Yeah.
what is the piece that's going to work for you? Because honestly, I might have a lot of learning, I might have a lot of data, I might have a lot of insights, right? But you're really the one that's in control. I'm just the co-pilot.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm so glad you used the word control because that's a word I was thinking about when you were talking about the mindfulness and the benefit of being in therapy is that I think it gives us more control over how we respond to things, how we look at situations. And I think about a CIA agent because I recently read a CIA agent's book, and he was
Nice.
talking about a moment where he thought he was caught when he was
Mm-hmm.
overseas on a mission. And he went into an arcade and he was analyzing which game do I play right now that I could actually like calm my mind and just like focus. So he picked a specific game that he could kind of like automatically do so that he could really focus on his breath so that he could regain control in that moment of almost getting caught. Like, okay, what's
Mhm.
the smartest thing for me to do right now? Because if I panic, I'm not going to make the smartest choice. But if
Right.
I can get myself to, if I can calm my nervous system, then I can make the right choice. So it really gives us this stronger sense of control, which a lot of people want. I
Hmm.
generally think about control as an illusion. Like there's not much that we really have control of. But if you want to have more control or feel like you have more control, I mean, honestly, I feel like we should rename meditation and mindfulness to mind control because that's what it gives you.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's the classic phrase, right? Like w if something's out of your control, you can always control yourself, right? And one of the ways that I like to frame meditation as well is it actually comes from my buddy, who's my teacher and really good friend, in the martial arts. He said, when everything feels out of control, you can always control your breath. That's why we say that that's like the most important piece of like the martial arts and the meditation and things like that. You can't control how fast your heart beats or how quickly your stomach digests, but you will always be able to control your breath.
That's super cool. One of my friends does professional martial arts, and he talks about how he has to do these resets, he calls them, like in the middle of a fight. He'll
Hmm.
have to do these resets with himself. And it's just like a breathing mindfulness kind of, sometimes it's a body release where he'll like shout, and that
Hmm.
helps him like release something,
Hmm.
tension probably, whatever.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that's so cool. And I think martial arts is, and Bessel van der Kolk talked about it when we saw him, that he has seen prisoners find mindfulness through boxing. Like,
Hmm.
what? That's
Mhm.
crazy.
Oh
So
yeah.
the connection is so cool.
Yeah, my buddy, and teacher, he and I actually do a traveling workshop where we will go to different ashrams and different centers to teach martial arts, but then also have lectures about how they coincide with a lot of the mental health stuff, which is really, really fun. We're actually about to do one later this week. We're going up to New York to do one up there. So, but it's always really, really fun because, and the martial arts makes it accessible. It's a very some people don't understand or don't realize yet until they get into it that a lot of the philosophies that come from these things actually can really be integrated into your daily life. Taking Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example, right? The whole idea is learning how to relax when you feel pressure, right? So how could you not take that into your daily life? Right. So it's
Yeah.
just there's such a cool crossover that we really aim to try to make it accessible, especially, for males, right? People that maybe aren't necessarily open to the mental health thing, but are more into maybe a fighting art or something along those lines because it seems more alpha or whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it, right? It's such a cool little way to kind of weasel in, some of that. Hey, maybe you can take this a step further. Maybe you can actually seek some of the mental health stuff because you're already learning it in a fighting setting. Why not bring it to the table?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for girls, we're always told yoga, 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 go to yoga. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of good research on that and whatever, but tends to be not something that guys want to do.
Right. Look for what's accessible.
Yeah, exactly. But even the way you talked about emotions being energy and like a chi kind of thing,
Yeah.
that's a very I don't know, you could say Eastern medicine kind of way of thinking about things. And I think there's a lot of, shall we say, like ancient truths to those things.
I find that a lot of things that we're doing in the therapy space are heavily inspired by a lot of these old arts. And really, one of my additional aims is to bridge those gaps because I think there's a lot of knowledge. I mean, even think about like EMDR, right? I mean, that alternating pattern back and forth, just that rhythm aspect. Life is rhythm. Think about shamanic drumming, right? Native American medicine circles. Like, I mean, it's all rhythm. It's all bilateral. It's just taking ancient things and bringing it into modern spaces.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so cool. Okay, so where do people find you if they need you, which I'm sure they do?
Well, so you can reach out to either Integrative Counsel or KDM Counseling Group. I can definitely provide my email address, but I always like to say that my cell phone is always on to anybody that just has questions, or wants to have a consultation or anything along those lines. So I can definitely provide. Is that something that you guys would post? Like if I just kind of gave you all of the
Yeah,
information, or do you
yeah,
need?
you can
Yeah.
give it to
Okay.
us.
Okay. Cool. So, yeah.
Yep.
So I can definitely, if there's like show notes or something along
Yeah.
those lines, we can definitely post it in there. But yeah, like I tell everybody, this is a lifestyle for me. My phone is always on. I don't have an off switch. So, please feel free to reach out to me. Just shoot me a text message, say hello, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions or even just have a quick conversation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This has been
Mhm.
great. And I actually have some people that might be reaching out to you soon.
Great.
Okay.
No, I
Yeah.
welcome the opportunity.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Great.
Thank you guys so much. This has been absolutely fantastic. I mean, both of you are so fantastic to talk to, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye.